Hello, everyone. This is Lindsey Welch with Decipher, and today I'm talking with Nicole Ozer, who is the Executive Director at the Electronic Frontier Foundation, or the EFF. So, Nicole, thank you so much for coming on today.
Yeah, thanks so much. Really excited to be here and get to talk to you all today.
Yeah, great. We have a lot that we can talk about. So for those of our listeners who don't know, Nicole leads kind of law and policy to advance rights and justice and democracy. And she's a legal expert on AI, privacy, and surveillance, as well as digital speech. So there is a lot that we can really focus on out of all of those topics. I know from my perspective, kind of the privacy aspect of it, the AI, kind of how that's coming into all of this. Those are top of mind for me as I'm looking at all the news and different things that are happening. But hey, would love to know, Nicole, like what's kind of top of mind for you right now when you're, taking the charge here at EFF and, talking to different people in the privacy space?
Yeah, I think probably some of the listeners are familiar with EFF, but for those folks who may not know, EFF, the Electronic Frontier Foundation, we're the leading nonprofit in the world that really works on making sure that technology supports rights and freedom and innovation for all people. We're member supported, so everything I talk about today and everything we do is because people are members of EFF. People support EFF with their time and their resources. And it's really exciting to be the new executive director at EFF. Probably some folks have known Cindy. Cindy has been, was at the organization for 26 years. And I took the torch from Cindy on June 1st. So it's been a very busy summer as the new executive director. While I'm new to EFF, I have spent my career in public interest technology law. So I'm a lawyer by training. I've really focused my entire career on making sure that technology does support rights and justice and freedom. I've been a longtime partner of EFF. Working in the courts on, high profile impact litigation at sort of all levels of state and federal court up to the U.S. Supreme Court. One of the first projects I ever worked on with EFF was all the NSA cases way back, starting in, the early 2000s that we litigated for, 10 plus years. Working on legislation as well on both the local and state and federal level to really safeguard rights, protect privacy, really landmark laws that we've been able to work on together. Big strategic campaigns to really push companies to be part of the solution and not exacerbate problems with privacy and surveillance. And really thinking about how we can work across issues and areas to, particularly now in the AI age, we're at this moment where we're in a really consequential moment right now. We are obviously living through incredibly consequential political times in terms of rights and justice and democracy. How technology is built, how it's used, is not a niche issue anymore. It's not sort of an issue that just a few people are thinking about or talking about or recognizing its importance. It's really fundamental to our rights, our livelihoods, literally our lives. When you see, ICE out in communities like Minneapolis and Los Angeles with face surveillance, and, ripping through communities, when you see sort of the decisions about how AI will be used on the local or state level by governments and how it's affecting jobs and, at sort of all socioeconomic levels, these are about sort of the fabric of our lives and our society. And so the work that we're doing at EFF, the work that folks are supporting us doing at EFF, the work that we are doing with, folks sort of across issue area and across jobs, these are really critical to the future of our countries and our families and our lives. So this is an exciting and an incredibly important time to be doing this work, and really proud to be leading EFF forward at this moment.
Yeah, absolutely. And, you're coming in at a really interesting time too, as you just mentioned. Even the past decade, like from a privacy perspective, we've had social media, we've had, Internet of Things devices that are rapidly expanding kind of the connected device wave that, brings digital devices into people's homes. And now we've got AI. So what is your perspective on AI? I know that there's been a lot of talk about, AI models from a cybersecurity perspective, but I would love to know more about what you're seeing in terms of the potential privacy concerns with AI as it relates to maybe how it's being used by, state and local governments or by police or by other, entities, I guess.
Yeah, I mean, I think what's important for people to realize is that, the current administration took office with the most sophisticated surveillance infrastructure of all time. Since 9/11, over 1 billion, so with a B, $1 billion a year has come down from the federal government to local communities to build surveillance infrastructure in the form, first it was video cameras, then it was drones, then it was license plate readers, then it was face recognition. A lot of the systems that we are now seeing, DHS and ICE utilizing in local communities and are being weaponized against local communities is the infrastructure that has sort of been slowly being built since 9/11. So I know, a lot of folks are now sort of realizing just how pervasive this is. Systems like Flock license plate reader surveillance that's, now in so many different communities. Um, so, you know, and AI really supercharges that surveillance. So, while there were video cameras that, started to be deployed in the early 2000s, a lot of that footage from video cameras or license plate readers, couldn't necessarily be utilized as fully as it now is with AI systems. And so I always talk about the fact that sort of our rights are protected by friction or they're protected by law. And sort of we had this moment, obviously, with the rise of computerization where things that had been in file cabinets were now in computers and could be searched. But now we're at sort of a completely different level of sort of the lack of friction because now all of those digital systems can now be even more quickly mined, searched, utilized through AI systems. And so the fact that a lot of our privacy law, hasn't been updated since the time when there were literally file cabinets or early computers. The Federal Electronic Communications Privacy Act hasn't been updated since 1986. That's the law that's supposed to control in terms of how the government can access records from providers. It has not been updated since the World Wide Web didn't exist. Cell phones were literally the size of bricks. Mark Zuckerberg was in diapers. That's how long it's been since that federal law was updated. And we sort of see across the board the fact that as technology has advanced exponentially, and now we're in this like even more exponential increase with AI, a lot of our privacy laws are still way back in the 1970s. There's a law that we've been working to update at EFF, that a lot of the privacy acts also only cover things like state records, but they don't cover local records. And so we sort of see these 1970s and 1980s laws that do not match the power of the technology currently. And we see a current federal administration that is fully utilizing whatever holes currently exist and pushing beyond whatever laws really exist, to really be able to fully utilize, all of that surveillance technology to really undermine rights, to threaten people's ability to speak out against the government, to engage in, massive immigration raids. And so, I'm somebody who believes in the power of technology for good. I'm from Silicon Valley. I see so much potential, for technology to actually be used to support rights and justice and democracy. But we're at a really critical moment about whether technology is going to support our lives or oppress people. And these are the consequential decisions about sort of what we do, what decisions we make in the courts, in the legislature, how we engage in these issues right now are really, writing the future for the next generation. And AI is a perfect example. Like such potential, amazing technology for good, but there need to be a channeling of that for good. The future of AI isn't written, and together we can really make sure that we are making sure that it's being used in ways that really protects creators and innovators, and supports people who are being affected by it and who are using it. And that's really core work to what I'm thinking about as I sort of take the helm at EFF, and how it can really make sure that AI is working for people.
Absolutely. That's a great point. And to your point about the future of AI not being written, like what sticks out to me from a privacy and also cybersecurity perspective is we don't know the full gambit of the use cases that AI can be utilized for at this point. Both good, but then also, as you mentioned, like potentially maybe a little more nefarious. So, like for instance, today I was reading about I think it was called Flock Safety, which is this vehicle surveillance company, was using an AI tool or had built one for police that could identify drivers and basically track vehicles by their patterns of movement alone. So like things like that, how can we get ahead of that, those types of use cases where we can have like more of a discussion and say, hey, we need these policies in place. We need these use cases to have defined boundaries so that we're not seeing potentially negative consequences from this, particularly for AI, where it is so new.
Yeah, I mean, one of the, I mentioned sort of this $1 billion that's been coming down every year from the federal government. And because that, it used to be that if communities were going to deploy police systems or surveillance systems, that conversation went through the city council to have sort of a thoughtful conversation about what is this going to do and how is it going to be used and what are the actual risks and costs of this. But what I started seeing, in the 2000s was as this money came down from the federal government, that grant money started circumventing sort of that, standard transparency and accountability and oversight that, functioned for, generations on the local level. Like, anything else you really wouldn't be sort of deploying in your community without actual conversation and public debate. And so in 2012, I actually, developed model language that now is actually passed in a lot of communities across the country, to create surveillance ordinances on the local level that would actually create those kind of mechanisms where wherever the money was coming from, there still needed to be public conversation, debate, community engagement, and actual like cost benefit analysis and evaluation of the system. So some of those surveillance ordinances exist, from sort of coast to coast. There's many of them in Massachusetts. There's many in California. There's one sort of all throughout the country. And now with AI, I think it's even more important to kind of have real mechanisms in place for really centering communities in conversation and really asking the why of AI and the whether of AI before jumping to the how. And I recently wrote a policy piece for the Federation of American Scientists, really sort of laying out this framework for state leaders to be thinking through, because there's a lot of deployments of AI that are happening on the state level without asking any of those foundational questions. It's a little bit like there's a lot of state leaders and local leaders are sort of buying this narrative that, this is a panacea, and are not really asking kind of those thoughtful questions and considering really the why and whether of AI before jumping to the how. And so that's a piece that I recently wrote. And now there's local ordinances and local policies which can also move forward. So I would just say that while AI is obviously a global issue, there are so many great opportunities to be working locally on these issues and to really be pushing for that kind of thoughtful decision making, particularly for folks who actually have some technical knowledge and capacity to be able to actually support their local communities in thinking through these issues. Because at least I've seen a lot of local communities be thinking about AI, but not really understanding, what its potential positive uses are, and also what are its limitations. And so, both sort of the piece that I wrote for the Federation of American Scientists, there's some good action items in there. And then also these surveillance ordinances, which currently exist, sort of utilizing some of that framework as well for AI. Also, even just there have been some laws passed in some communities across the country, literally even just to do an AI inventory of what are systems that are already in place, because a lot of communities are actually deploying AI and people don't even know what it's being used for or how it's being used. And I'll give one example just to kind of illustrate some of the questions that come up and really maybe not thinking about the implications. There was a community not too far away that, originally when people walked into the community centers, they just, signed a sign-up sheet with their, with information that they had come in, and they could sort of track how many people actually used the community center. They didn't take names, but it was just, making sure to know, like, are our services actually being utilized and sort of what times of day. And there was a decision that they should actually move to an AI system to do that. Well, now they're collecting a lot more information about who people are and where they go and what they do. And some of these communities are actually immigrant communities where people are actually going to community centers to access important information about rights and keeping themselves safe, or, language, classes. And now all that information is sitting in databases, not necessarily protected in terms of the federal government reaching in. So that's like a prime example of like somebody decided it would be a good idea just to kind of put an AI wrapper on this, on this sort of community center sign up without necessarily thinking about, do we want to actually be collecting more information? What is the potential sort of risk scenarios here? And that's just sort of a microcosm of what I'm seeing sort of across the country on sort of the jumping to AI. There's a lot of great uses for AI, and things that really, end up, uh, you know, end up being able to actually utilize staffing resources in more efficient and effective ways. But this is an example where, really needing to sort of think deeper about the why and whether.
Yeah, absolutely. That's a pretty interesting example. And what's funny is that from my reporting, I also see a lot of these same exact challenges and questions that you posed. Also, hitting the private sector as well. So this is just across the board, really. Um, I also, yeah,
I was just saying, it's been interesting that I've also been talking to folks sort of in the private sector where there was sort of a jump to utilize AI. And a lot of the engineers I've talked to are like, we end up spending more time trying to sort of debug what's happened sort of later on. Because, it doesn't really work in the ways that we would want it to. And so I do think we're, again, there's so much potential for really thinking thoughtfully about the right ways to use AI. I just think that's, so often where we kind of see people sort of jumping on the bandwagon without thinking about what really makes sense for this use case, this deployment, this population, this need, and to have a more nuanced approach to it.
right. That makes sense. I wanted to go back to something you said earlier about privacy policies and things of that nature. And it's interesting. I don't have much experience with kind of policies around privacy and surveillance, at least, but I've done a fair amount of reporting on the cybersecurity side of things, and specifically data breach notifications and things of that nature. And what sticks out to me is just kind of how fragmented, I guess, different policies are across different states, and there's just a lot of different challenges there. And I guess I would love to hear more from your perspective on the privacy and surveillance side of policies, both at the federal and state level. Like, is there anything that seems to be working? Are there things that could be changed? How do you see, policy in this area moving forward?
Yeah, big picture, the federal government has not been very effective in passing laws that, match the progress of technology. As I said, there's only a handful of federal privacy laws that have really passed since the 1970s. And states have been incredibly important in passing laws that really, are keeping pace with technology and are, you know, being thoughtful about how, the benefits of technology and also how to make sure that that technology actually, works for people. Um, you know, Many states, California, Massachusetts, like different coasts, there have been, important laws also passed in Texas and in Utah. So this isn't just sort of blue states, but, sort of across the spectrum. A lot of the privacy laws have been bipartisan. I mentioned that ECPA, the Federal Electronic Communications Privacy Act, hasn't been updated since 1986. But I spearheaded the passage of the California Electronic Communications Privacy Act in 2015. Which was a bipartisan piece of legislation. It was actually supported by the major technology companies as well as civil liberties organizations like EFF. And I was at the ACLU for 20 years. We worked on this law together, and it really updated electronic surveillance law for the modern digital age. And it requires a warrant when any government entity wants to search a cell phone or demand information, location information, text messages, other types of content from a service provider. And so laws that have been passed in states have been incredibly important. Data breach notification laws started on the state level. There have been a lot of important new laws starting to be passed on AI. What we've though seen is at least the current administration has really tried to move preemption forward. Preemption means that you pass a law on the federal level, which wipes away things that are able to happen on the state or local level. And, you know, technology moves so quickly, it's incredibly important to be able to have state regulation, state law that's able to be more nimble than what the federal government can do. And so I will say that, some people call, the different laws in different states a patchwork. That's not, many types of law are different from state to state. Criminal law is completely different from state to state. Employment law is completely different from state to state. That's a feature, not a bug, that states actually can move law forward. And people can always comply with the most stringent state, and then you can comply with everything. So patchwork is really a sort of a narrative that has been pushed, but the realities are states are the laboratories of democracy. States are incredibly important for moving law forward in terms of technology, and really getting being thoughtful and getting the nuance right on these types of laws. So, number one, I would say, it's incredibly important that states have the flexibility to continue to pass laws and regulation. It's absolutely necessary, particularly with how quickly AI is moving. And, it's really important to push back on any attempts to have a federal bill that would preempt state laws. But it would be ideal to also have a robust federal law, that has the right protections in place and that actually can be enforced. Because what we also see a lot of times is that laws are passed that actually don't have a way for people to utilize them in terms of a private right of action or other types of enforcement provisions. And a law that cannot be enforced by people often gets reduced to just words on paper, because there's no, the government or companies, know that they don't have to follow it and there won't be any repercussions. And so, CalECBA, which we passed in California, if the government doesn't follow the law, that evidence can't be used in court. There's a suppression remedy. And, in the government context, having a suppression remedy and making sure that if the government doesn't follow the law, that the evidence can't be used in court is incredibly important. And having robust enforcement provisions by attorneys general and also private rights of action, where people can go to court if their rights have been violated, is incredibly important to make sure the law is followed, and honestly is incredibly important for people's belief in democracy. If there's laws that aren't followed and your rights have been violated and you can't get anyone to follow that law, then you can imagine that people start to lose faith in whether or not the system really works for them. And so I really see robust enforcement provisions as, not just important for a particular law, but really important for sort of the fabric of our society and people believing that the system works for, you don't have to just be rich for the system to work for you, that there's, the law is actually written for everybody and can be used by everybody.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a good point. Yeah, I wanted to ask, backing up again a little bit, you mentioned flock cameras, and, I feel like there's been a fair amount of, I guess I want to do like a quick temperature check. Like, do you feel like people, like the average consumer or person, is very aware of privacy concerns? And the reason I ask is because I know there was a fair amount of backlash to flock cameras, but then also from the cybersecurity standpoint, I'm always curious. Sometimes I feel as though I'm reading about this every day and I'm talking to people about it every day. And then when you go talk to the average person, maybe they're not as aware of some of the cybersecurity issues that I see. So I'm curious your thoughts, kind of translating that over to the privacy part of the spectrum, because I do think there is a lot of discussions about privacy that people have, but I would love to see what you hear or what you think when it comes to kind of the average person who's, just reading about these topics or seeing them in the news?
So I've been in public interest technology law for 25 years. I would say that there has been a lot of progress in the last 25 years of people sort of understanding and recognizing how critical these technology issues are to, their daily lives. When I first went to law school, and said, that I wanted to work on the intersection of, I wanted to work on public interest technology issues and think about the intersection of rights and justice and technology. People were still pretty confused about me. They were like, "Are you a technology lawyer? Are you a public interest lawyer?" But I think, even just the past couple of years, obviously, so much that's been happening politically, people have really started to see the real implications. And there was a story last year about license plate reader surveillance and sort of how pervasive it has become. And, John Oliver just did a segment on his show about surveillance, and a lot of that has been work we've all been doing since 2006, 2008. When the Associated Press did a story last year, I actually pulled out the talking points from 2008, where I was like, if license plate reader surveillance is tracking who you are and where we go, it means it knows if you've gone to seek reproductive, healthcare. It knows if you've gone to a political rally. It knows if you've gone to a gun show. It knows if you've gone out over state lines. And the fact that those kind of tools in, a certain political climate could absolutely be weaponized against, speaking out, about seeking care, about keeping your family safe, about keeping, your community safe. Um, and, those hypotheticals have now become the reality. It's something I never wanted to see happen, but has become the reality. And I think people are now face to face with the fact that the kinds of threats that have been identified for a lot of years are now the reality of, you see an ICE officer literally, tracking who a person is who's, a bystander, who's trying to record sort of what's happening in that community. And so I think people are really realizing what's really at stake. But we're also up against really formidable forces, in terms of passing the types of laws that really will make sure that technology is supporting people rather than, undermining rights and justice. And that's really core work of what EFF is doing. EFF was created in 1990 to really see around these corners, to really bring the legal and technical expertise together to inform policymakers, to bring court cases, to build public interest technology ourselves that will help protect people's privacy and their free expression. So everything we do, from the court cases we file to the legislation that we testify about, to the support we provide for local or state or federal or international policymakers, to building, Privacy Badger and CertBot, to encrypt the web. We are really sort of bringing that deep expertise and that through line of sort of understanding these issues, to the most, consequential fights of our time. And so that's why, as somebody who has spent their career thinking about these issues, to be leading EFF in this moment, is a real honor, but also a real responsibility. And, just want to say that, there's an opportunity for everybody to get involved in this work, on the local level, on the state level. Um, you know, we definitely want to, I'm going to be doing a bit of a road show with some in-person events as well. So I hope to see you all. I just did a really great live stream with Cory Doctorow on AI. So, engage with EFF, engage with these issues. If you're not yet a member, I hope you will be, because all the work we're doing right now is only possible because of the folks who believe we can build a future where technology really supports rights and freedom and innovation. And there's no more important time to be doing that than now.
Absolutely. Yeah. Well, I feel like that's a great point to kind of end our interview here. I know, with like you said, with AI, things are going to be moving pretty rapidly in the coming months and year. So, would love to kind of keep this conversation going and continue to check in with you. And I really appreciate you coming on to the Decipher podcast. Thank you so much.
Absolutely. And we have a new AI landing page at EFF.org. So, sort of on the range of issues that we're working on AI. And again, my recent live stream as well is also available for people to watch with Cory and me talking about AI. So, I'd love to be back. And thank you for inviting me to be with you today.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Nicole.